All right. We have a good turnout. It's great to see everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Dr. Elena Traster in the Environmental Studies Department here at MCLA, and this is another one of our Green Living seminars. This semester they're focusing around the theme Rewilding Our World. They take place here in the Feigenbaum Center for Science and Innovation on the MCLA campus on Wednesdays at 5:30. They're all free and open to the public, and you can take a look online at our schedule for upcoming presentations. It's at www.mcla.edu/greenliving. And before I introduce our speaker for today, I would like to invite you to all come back next week on Wednesday, February 26th. We'll be hearing from Renee Secor. She is the Carnivore Conservation Director for Project Coyote, and she will be presenting a lecture titled The Future of Wolves in the Northeast. Today's presentation, titled Rewilding the Northeast, will be given by Jon Leibowitz, who is the President and CEO of Northeast Wilderness Trust, the only regional land trust dedicated exclusively to forever wild conservation. He earned his JD and Master's in Environmental Law and Policy from Vermont Law School and holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Colorado Boulder. Prior to coming to the Northeast Wilderness Trust, he served as executive director of the Montezuma Land Conservancy in Colorado. He's also a co-owner of Wild Edge Brewing Collective in Cortez, Colorado. Thanks so much for coming tonight.
I was thrilled to arrive early and listen to the class that's going on. I could only have dreamt of taking a course like that when I was in college, and it's just so cool that you guys have that opportunity. So I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then I'd love to really get into a good conversation about rewilding, and I hope you bring lots of questions. So tonight I'm going to talk about wilderness and rewilding, and really the stories of possibility, which is really what rewilding is all about. And I'm going to start with a story about where I grew up. I'm a New Englander by choice and grew up in South Florida. And so 40-odd years ago, a lot of South Florida looked like this. And that's me and my dad when I was 6 years old, or I lived there for the first 6 years of my life. And our home was surrounded by these incredible pine trees and saw palmettos. And this was not a rural area by any means, but a lot of Miami actually looked like this 40 years ago. In our backyard, there was a path that wound its way around this pine forest. And when I got a little older, I spent a lot of time back there walking with my family dog. His name was Snuggles. And I remember this path as if it went on for miles. And back there were a family of foxes and possum, raccoons, tons of spiders, and most vividly of all, I remember a species of butterfly that lived there called the Miami blue butterfly. When I got older, I learned that this path was kind of like 100 feet long, but back then it was long enough to leave an incredibly vivid impression on me and foster a connection with those local critters who lived there. And I can still today recall how vibrant and lush it all felt. And this place, in many ways, no longer exists. In 1992, Hurricane Andrew clobbered Miami, leveling most of those remnant pockets of pine forest. And with the exploding population of South Florida, that tropical pined rockland ecosystem, as it was called, functionally disappeared from Miami-Dade. And today, only 2% of that ecosystem exists today outside of Everglades National Park. And that butterfly, the Miami blue, completely disappeared from Miami-Dade and was only recently found on an isolated island in Florida Keys in 1999. And so I share this story because it's a story of less, and that's less biodiversity, less abundance, and less natural beauty. Many of you here might have a story like that from your childhood that tied you to a place, and perhaps that place no longer exists like mine did. And even if you don't have a story like that, I suspect that most of us here could rattle off alarming statistics about ecological loss today. I heard some in the class talk about wolves and cougars that used to be here, and that's a great example of that. And across the world, you could talk about the shrinking Amazon, the decimation of the American buffalo, disappearance of wolves and pumas right here in New England, also called mountain lions, or if you live in Vermont like I do, catamounts we call them. Wildlife species are in decline across the world, and so the truth is that if you love wild things, you know that recent history has been a story of loss, less biodiversity, less abundance, and less natural beauty. But it doesn't have to be that way, and I promise that that's all the bad news that I'm going to share tonight. Tonight is not about doom and gloom. I don't think anything has ever been solved through despair, and hope, on the other hand, has a solid track record. And there is a proven and hopeful path forward that not only stops ecological destruction, but actually reverses it. A process that partners with nature rather than works against it, and one that leads to more biodiversity and more abundance and more beauty. And that path is rewilding, the topic of tonight. And so rewilding restores ecosystems, not through control or manipulation, but by trusting in nature's innate resilience to heal, which has been honed over hundreds of millions and billions of years. It's about giving land back to wildlife and wildlife back to the land, which my friend Jon Davis, who's the director of the Rewilding Institute, has distilled down to. And you can even distill it even further. Rewilding can be said in two words, and that's wilderness recovery. And I know the class here heard from Reed Noss a few weeks ago, or whenever that was, and him and Dave Foreman kind of coined this phrase, rewilding, a few decades ago, and they came up with, this is all about wilderness recovery. So I work for an organization called Northeast Wilderness Trust. What is our role in this? We work on rewilding the Northeast by protecting specific places as wilderness. And wilderness are places that are protected as forever wild, where nature directs the ebb and flow of life. And we envision at the organization and are actively working to establish across the region a landscape of connected and resilient wildlands shared by a human culture that cares about these places. And so we envision a future northern forest where bears and bobcats and warblers and wildflowers and pumas again and people are all thriving side by side. And we work across the Northeast from the Adirondacks in New York to the coast of Maine, down to here in Massachusetts and Connecticut. And we've protected just shy of about 100,000 acres of wilderness across the region. All of the photos in this presentation that are of landscapes, like this one, are of actual places that Northeast Wilderness Trust protects. This is the Woodbury Mountain Wilderness Preserve, about 20 minutes north of where I live in northern Vermont. So, what is wilderness? It's in our title. It's referenced in Rewilding. Wilderness is land that is left to its own will. And so the root of the word, the etymological root of the word wilderness, as researched by this article that you can see by Jay Vest, who's a member of the Monacan Nation, means will of the land. So wilderness is self-willed land, a place where natural processes are free to direct the ebb and flow of life. And I'm going to return a number of times to this theme of freedom. And so let's keep talking about that. And so here is an example of such a place. This is a remnant tract of old growth in Maine. We now call it Howland Research Forest. The Wilderness Trust bought this in 2007 to keep it from being logged. And if you look at this photo, you'll notice some stuff that you might not see very often in forests around here or generally in New England. And you'll see that there's lots of tip-ups, trees that are fallen over. You see really old trees. You see young trees. You see moss-covered floor. There's lichen. There's cavities that are created by these fallen trees. All of these things around here, if given time and freedom to rewild, this is what a forest in New England wants to look like, or at least this one in Maine. And this complexity is not only beautiful, it also creates resiliency. And forests like these, they want to be a little messy. A wild forest in New England, if given time, has tons of coarse-woody debris, which is all of these fallen trees and snags and tip-ups and all this stuff. And as Henry David Thoreau wrote in 1864 of the Maine's North Woods, where this is, they want to be a little mossy and moosey as well. And what's really cool about this property particularly is that there were trees living at Howland Research Forest, still today, that were just teenagers when Henry David Thoreau wrote those words in 1864. And so I want to return to this theme of freedom. Freedom to be, and that focus on this theme of freedom perfectly aligns with the language that defines wilderness in the Wilderness Act of 1964, which created our system of wilderness lands on federal public lands, and that would include Green Mountain National Forest and White Mountain National Forest here in northern New England. And the act defines wilderness as an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled. So what does that mean? Untrammeled means free. And so Howard Zonheiser, the principal author of the Wilderness Act, who's pictured here at his family cabin in the Adirondacks in New York, consciously used that word untrammeled in the law's definition because he understood that a legal framework to create wilderness is not comprised of pristine land. It's not comprised of places that somehow escaped the axe or were never affected by people. He knew that the primary characteristic of wilderness was freedom. And the Wilderness Act itself, this is really important, doesn't contain a single time the words pristine or untouched or unpeopled, because the primary characteristic of wilderness is not purity or some mythical primordial type of place. It's simply freedom for the land itself. So the Adirondacks, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this place. Is anyone here, are you familiar with the Adirondack Park in New York? All right, a few of you? All right. So the Adirondacks are just across Lake Champlain from where I live, maybe about 200 miles from here. And it is one of the most remarkable protected areas on the planet, and arguably the premier example of landscape scale rewilding on Earth. And so 60 years after Howard Zonheiser from that previous photo was inspired by the rewilding of the Adirondacks, I had a chance to intimately experience it last year when I hiked the Northville Placid Trail, which is a 140-mile trail that goes through the heart of the Adirondack Park. And these are photos that I took of, I'm obsessed with big trees, so these are photos of big trees from the park. And for 10 hours a day, I did this in about a week, I walked through the rewilding forests, and I was reminded personally of the promise of wilderness and what wilderness can mean for the entire region. Wilderness leads to a world of more, and so for countless hours on this trail, I walked by these big trees, and they're not like the exception to the rule like they are in New England. All day, every day, I walked by trees that were bigger than almost any tree that I ever see in New England anywhere, and they were just how things are in the Adirondacks. I heard warblers in the treetops. I heard peregrines in cliffs above the canopy. I saw black bear on my trip. I saw moose. I walked through dozens of beaver ponds on this trail. All of this region is just teeming with life. And what's remarkable about the Adirondacks is that it wasn't always that way. The park today is undeniably wilder and healthier than it was a century ago, and it's healed from the industrial past through rewilding. And so it's really interesting that the recovery of the Adirondack Park wasn't accomplished through active management at all, but through passive rewilding. By legally protecting this landscape as wilderness and people taking an intentional step to step up and then step back, New Yorkers have offered the Adirondacks the gift of time, at this point well over 120 years, to heal and do what nature does best. If you step back, nature heals. And at the same time, the Adirondacks have provided unrivaled opportunity for traditional recreational pursuit like hunting and paddling and hiking, which in turn serves as the economic driver for the region. So today, this is a really amazing map. The Adirondack Park, as it exists today, is larger than Yosemite, Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Great Smoky Mountains, and Glacier National Park combined. It is the largest protected area in the lower 48, and within it, nearly 3 million acres are protected as forever wild. And to put that into perspective, the park, which is slightly smaller than Vermont as a point of comparison, by itself hosts 2.5 times more wilderness than all of New England combined. And I know the class was just looking at a map, and we'll show one similar to how much wilderness actually exists in New England. And so the park is proof that wilderness can help nature heal and that abundance can return. Nature, again, is wildly resilient, and we know this if given space and time and protected as wilderness. And so this is a story of recovery and hope. Our mission at the Northeast Wilderness Trust is inspired directly by the Adirondack Park and its recovery and its commitment to freedom. And so at Northeast Wilderness Trust, this is a quote that my predecessor came up with. We say that wilderness is not simply a special kind of place, but rather a special commitment we make to a place. And that commitment, again, this word, is freedom to animals and to the natural processes that produce integrity, beauty, and diversity of the land community. And so if wilderness, by this definition, is a choice, then also by definition, it can exist wherever we humans decide to make that choice. Again, to step up with intentionality and then step back. And so I'm going to show you a couple examples of places that Northeast Wilderness Trust protects. So this is the Alder Stream Wilderness Preserve. If you can imagine in Maine where Baxter State Park is, this is just southeast of Baxter. It's a complex that's now about 15,000 acres between land that we own and land that we have conservation easements on with adjacent landowners. And this is, one of the wilder places in Maine, full of this incredible wetland complex. That is the actual Alder Stream in this photo. It's amazing for paddling in the spring. And so moving west, this is in New Hampshire. This is the Binney Hill Wilderness Preserve. It's right on the boundary of Massachusetts on the north side of that. The historic Wapak Trail, which was an inspiration to the Long Trail, which then inspired the Appalachian Trail, goes right through this property. It's in extreme southern New Hampshire, as I said, and what's really cool about this place, on wildlife cameras, we've captured tons of moose on this property, which is really far south for moose. And they're just all over this place, and it just shows that connectivity, whether through hiking trails and corridors or protecting these core habitats, really benefits wildlife. So then moving west again, this is the Woodbury Mountain Wilderness Preserve that I highlighted before, just north of where I live. This is 7,000 acres, and it's the largest non-governmental, so that means protected by us as a nonprofit, the largest non-governmental wilderness area in the state of Vermont. And this is, again, in a wildlife corridor, a theme that I keep talking about. And it connects, the corridor is an identified area that connects the Green Mountains to the Connecticut River Valley into New Hampshire. And this is just a really extraordinary landscape just north of the capital city of Vermont, capital town, maybe. Going further west is, this is a photo of the Grass River Wilderness Preserve. So this is in New York. It's not in the Adirondack Park, but it's actually directly adjacent to it on the west side. And it is in another identified wildlife corridor called the Algonquin to Adirondack Corridor, or the A2A. And the A2A was made famous by a moose who had a tag on her so people could track her. Her name was Alice the Moose. And she traveled from the Algonquin Park in Canada to the Adirondacks, and we learned, not we, but scientists and researchers, learned that this was an important corridor for wildlife connectivity between this huge provincial park in Canada and the Adirondack Park. It's also a place where we believe wolves could eventually repopulate this area naturally. Not cougars for other reasons, but it's an important corridor. And so the next one is really interesting. It actually sits, it's in an urban context, so very different than all these places. And it actually sits next to a Walmart supercenter and a subdivision. And it is in an urban area. It's right here in Massachusetts. This is called the Muddy Pond Wilderness Preserve. It's about 300 acres in Kingston, which is right next to Plymouth in southeast Massachusetts. This little pocket of wilderness has over 24 vernal pools. This is one of them, just teeming with amphibians and tons of wildlife. And what's unique about this place, and it gets back to the idea of wilderness being about freedom, just because this is in an urban context surrounded by development doesn't make this any less wild or any less of a wilderness area than the other places I talked about. Because again, the common theme for wilderness is that commitment to freedom. And so we manage this passively and allow nature to direct the ebb and flow of life, just like we do on 10,000 acres in northern New England. And so all these places that I shared are part of a growing network of wilderness areas being stitched together parcel by parcel, tract by tract, across the region that serve as both core areas, like one of those larger, maybe the 10,000 acre example, or stepping stones in wildlife corridors for wildlife to move across the Northeast. And this is how we are rewilding the Northeast. So I'm going to go through a couple of the values that we talk about on why is wilderness special, why is it worth protecting, and why I hope you care about seeing more wilderness or wildlands or forever wildland in the Northeast. And so we believe at Northeast Wilderness Trust, and this is central to our mission, that wild landscapes and wild species who call them home simply have a right to live and flourish regardless of any benefit whatsoever that they provide to people. And so that's the intrinsic value of wild nature. We also know that before this area was settled by Europeans, a vast majority of the Northeast were old forests. And we also know that wildlife species over millions of years in between ice ages, if you will, evolved with these old forests, and they thrive within old forests. And so we know that wilderness areas benefit biodiversity. We also know that wild forests become old forests. When you protect a piece of land and you don't cut trees down, it eventually turns into an old forest. And we know that old forests store and sequester immense amounts of carbon, which makes them wonderful for helping mitigate climate change. Baselines for the surrounding landscape. So wilderness areas, this is a value that often is not talked about. Wilderness areas act as the control. If you can think about a scientific study, wilderness areas are the control for management of the rest of the landscape. Whether you're managing for old growth, you're managing for timber products, you're doing ecological management. How do you know what the landscape would look like if it was left alone? Wilderness acts as that control. The next value that we talk about is solace and reflection. So whether for cultural, religious, or other reasons, wilderness areas and the quiet that they provide offer spiritual and physical renewal for people and human well-being for those that seek these places out. And similar to that, but a slightly different perspective, is recreational value. Recreational pursuit has always been essential to wilderness designations. Particularly because wilderness was created as a counterforce to modernity and the westward expansion of this country. And so it's long been viewed as a place for people to reconnect with the natural world. And finally is resiliency. So as forests grow old, they also increase in complexity. So if you think about that picture from Howland Research Forest that I shared. And as forests get more complex, they also increase their complexity and structure and function, and that increases their resiliency to stress, such as climate change and pests. So those are the values that we talk about for wilderness. And if we want to see more of that on the landscape, and we want to see wildlife thrive, and we want our forests to maximize carbon capture in this age of climate change, I would argue that we need more wilderness. And that story of more wilderness has been the story of the Adirondack Park. But it can also be the story of New England. And that story is still being written, and that's what Northeast Wilderness Trust is engaged in. We have the opportunity right now to write the next chapter of New England's land use. And so the Northeast is fortunate to have been given a second chance. A century ago, nearly 75% of New England and New York, to a certain extent, was deforested. Today, it's the exact opposite, give or take a few percentages. And this is one illustration of that reforestation in action. And this is a place near where I live. This is the White River in Vermont. It's a famous historic photo of a log drive from those days. And it's a reminder of how recently this was common in New England. And here it is today. That's the White River, fully reforested. It's the longest free-flowing river to the Connecticut in Vermont. And so the forests of the Northeast have regrown, and that's an amazing story, but they haven't fully recovered, and that's where rewilding comes in. So we live in one of the world's most important temperate forests. The northern forest is globally important for climate change and for biodiversity, and it's actually one of the rare examples of recovery over the last century. So this map shows all of the broadleaf temperate forests across the world about a century ago. And this one, so put that in your mind's eye. Look at how much green there is in this band across the northern hemisphere. That is the extent of broadleaf northern forests today. And you can see, so I'm going to go backwards. We are in the red outline, and that's basically New England, and then that circle next to it is like the Adirondacks, Tug Hill Plateau area. And you can see while most other places have shrunk, ours remains relatively intact. And though this forest has remained intact, and that is an incredible story, most of it is still very young. And most of the forest of New England is between 50 and 100 years old. And due to management, for forest products or whatever the reason, much of it is going to stay that way. That can change through targeted conservation and through rewilding. So this is a similar map to what some of you saw earlier today. How are we doing protecting wild places? Here's a map that shows all of the conserved land in the Northeast. Everything in green has been conserved, and this includes public land. You can see Baxter right in the middle of Maine, all of those big industrial timberlands north of Baxter, the White Mountain National Forest right in the middle of New Hampshire, the Green Mountains, which are more of a north-south orientation in Vermont. Massachusetts has done an incredible job of protecting a lot of land, and then of course the Adirondacks and the Catskills in southern New York. So all land conservation is vitally important, and I can't stress that enough. But when it comes to biodiversity protection and carbon storage, not all land conservation is the same. And so I want you again to keep this in your mind's eye, and I'm going to show the exact same data, only the places in New England that have been protected as wild. So all conservation, 25% of the region. And there is all of the land, the extent of wilderness across the Northeast. This, so it's in two colors because it's two different data sets. The red is of New England, the orange is of New York. In New England, that red accounts for just 3.3% of the entire region that's been protected as wild. And a bit more if you include New York, of course. And here in Massachusetts, that number is even less. Out of the entire landmass of Massachusetts, only 2.3% is protected as wild. And what that means is that here in Massachusetts, or whether you want to extend to the entire region, that only about 2 or 3% of the entire area is legally protected in a way that we know will grow old and be tomorrow's old-growth forests. In other words, 97% or so of the region is managed either for forest products, just to be managed, agricultural land, or developed, or just unprotected and at risk of being cut. So it's a sliver of our landscape that's actually protected in a way that we know is going to grow old. The good news is that we have the knowledge, and we have the tools, and we have the power to change that. And so this is precisely the work of Northeast Wilderness Trust. We are dedicated to changing that reality. And more than 2 decades ago, after being founded by a group of wilderness enthusiasts, we now protect, again, just shy of 100,000 acres, and we're trying to expand that as quickly as we can. And we do conservation a little differently. At the Wilderness Trust, we proudly protect nature for nature's sake, while also recognizing the immense and obvious benefits that wild places offer to people. And we're stitching together wildlife habitat and corridors to realize that vision of a connected and whole landscape. And so we believe in the idea that wild places and creatures like this family that I'm about to show you, who lives on a Northeast Wilderness Trust preserve, simply have a right to be and to exist. Let's see if I can get this to work. So Northeast Wilderness Trust preserves in these wild places, they're not just spots on a map. They're not just places that we protect to, ratchet up the percentage. They are home to myriad wild species and our wild kin who live here. This video is part of a wildlife camera research project that we're doing that focuses on coarse woody debris. And we're trying to figure out how wildlife utilizes these features on the landscape on our preserve. So what I mean by coarse woody debris is that this is a large downed log, the trunk of a big old tree. And this is one of hundreds of videos that we see of wildlife literally walking across this regularly. So we know that wildlife uses coarse woody debris. And we also know that the average forest around New England is sorely lacking these kind of features. There's seeing tons of downed trees, which normally could make up 40% of the entire biomass in a forest, is a rare thing in a lot of forests in New England. When you protect a place as wilderness, this is what's going to naturally happen over time. Oops, there's the bears again. All right, so I'm going to conclude my talk with one more story about another backpacking trip. And you've heard a story about ecological loss from Miami. You've heard a story about recovery from the Adirondacks. And now I'm going to share a story about what is possible with rewilding. And so a couple of years ago, I had the immense privilege to backpack across the Alaskan Peninsula, about 150 miles from east to west on the peninsula through extraordinary wild country. And on this hike, we saw caribou, Arctic fox, 100+ grizzly bears very close to us. And I can say that with complete assurance because one of the people in my party counted every single one of them, and we have an accurate tally of the grizzly bears that we saw. And we paddled miles and miles of rivers just like this that were chock full of salmon by the thousand. Alaska, and the peninsula specifically, but all of the state, is a landscape that's just completely bursting with wild beauty and abundance. Now, you may be asking, what in the world does Alaska have to do with New England? I went to Alaska with very specific intention and was invited by a group of conservationists for a very specific reason. And it was to witness firsthand what wildness feels like on a grand scale. and to experience a place where the land and its community of life is still shaped by the natural processes that have always shaped it, and it has the freedom to be exactly what it wants to be. Much of Alaska is protected as federally designated wilderness. But I was also there to get a better understanding of what is missing from my home here in New England, and what New England once was, and what it can be again. And so the point of this trip was to remove myself from what we call ecological amnesia, or shifting baseline syndrome, you might have heard, that we all suffer from here, that makes us think that today's forests that we experience in New England are normal, and they are anything but normal. And so as I hiked in Alaska and marveled at this spectacle of wilderness and the wholeness of the place, I couldn't help but dream about a New England from just a couple centuries ago. That New England had runs of salmon and shad and sturgeon and eels swimming hundreds of miles upland in great rivers like the Connecticut and the Merrimack and the Penobscot, feeding people, feeding animals, and feeding the land itself. And wolves and pumas were preying on deer and moose and all of those fish. And ancient forests defined the region rather than today when they are just these tiny remnant pockets of the landscape that we live in. And so these scenes to me felt like a distant memory compared to the place that we all now live in. But in ecological time, or tree time, as we say at Northeast Wilderness Trust, those scenes basically were yesterday. And so if you recall the Howland Research Forest that I was talking about before in Maine, there is a yellow birch who lives on that property today, and it's been cored, so we know this precisely, who is over 360 years old living on Howland Research Forest and has witnessed all of that change that I just talked about in a single lifetime of a tree. We have completely forgotten what abundance in New England looks like. We've lost sight of what once was. And because of that, many of us, including myself, struggle to imagine what is possible again here in New England. But we can return to that period as easily as it left us, and we can do that through rewilding. Alaska, as it exists today and always has, is a reminder of nature's abundance. And I hope that it serves as a beacon for what we can think of and what we can dream of as possible here in New England. This picture is not of that yellow birch or of Howland, but it is of an incredible old growth forest in the Adirondacks. And that is just it's a reminder of what, again, is a remnant pocket of what used to be the entire region. And so I want to imagine together a future New England 100 years from now. If I'm so lucky, I would say in my grandchildren's lifetime. And this future New England is cloaked in green, rivaling any temperate forest on the planet for its beauty and for its wildness. Towering pines stretch 125 feet into the sky, and century-old maples and birches and hemlock and beech are a common sight, rather than just these standout trees that we see today every now and then. And in the spring, I want you to imagine waves of warblers that sing in the canopy of this old forest, and great schools of salmon and shad, again filling free-flowing, undammed rivers. And pumas and wolves have come home to New England, keeping deer in check, and moose have recovered from their population lows right now, and again occupy the wet corners of the landscape. And importantly, farmlands and well-managed timberlands are all interwoven within this expansive wilderness, and they're all knitted together so all the region's creatures, including us, can pursue lives of freedom and quality. I believe that this is a future that's worth working toward. It's a future of more biodiversity, more abundance, and more natural beauty. And it's a future that not only wildlife benefits from, but we all benefit from as human beings. It is a wilder future than what we exist in today. And all it takes is a little intention in setting aside places today as wilderness or as forever wild and allowing more of the Northeast to rewild. That's my presentation. Thank you very much. So I think we have ample time, and I would love to answer questions, anything that's on your mind about the organization or rewilding or wilderness. Yeah?
What's your next backpacking trip?
That's a great question. I'm always planning the next one. There's a loop in the western Maine mountains that is right next to two of our preserves and the Appalachian Trail. It's through the Mahoosucs, and I'll be doing that this spring. I've never hiked that area before, so I'm very excited. Lots of wilderness there, or ecological reserves as they're called in Maine. Yeah, in the back.
Oh, I was just curious what, if you have a comment on the issue of invasives and rewilding and whether they should be managed or not?
Yeah, great question. So I'll repeat the question. Do we have a view on invasives, specifically at Northeast Wilderness Trust, I would say, and whether they should be managed? So that is, of course, a loaded question, and there's a lot of layers to the answer. I'll first start by saying that all of our legal mechanisms that we use at Northeast Wilderness Trust, whether we're holding a conservation easement on an individual or another land trust or just land that we own ourselves, we have the legal ability to manage for invasives. So I think it's important to say that because one of the misconceptions about forever wild conservation is that there's zero ability to manage for any invasives. Now that said, at Northeast Wilderness Trust, we do not manage for invasives. We have the legal ability to, but we choose not to on land that we own. And we do that for a number of reasons. So if you recall the slide where I looked at all the values, we think that wilderness areas serve a really important role as a control or a baseline to compare the landscape to. If you think about the fact that 95%, whatever the big number is that you want to use, of the Northeast is either managed or young forest or open to management, whatever it is, the reality is that almost all of our comparisons when we say invasives are really bad and they're doing this and that, they're on landscapes that are disturbed for one way or another. And invasive species, we like to use the word opportunistic species, they thrive on disturbance. And when you have a closed canopy forest that is largely undisturbed by really like industrial manipulation, skidders and logging and all this kind of stuff, we have found that the invasives that live on our properties, they're there, they're not expanding rapidly, we observe them, and we have the ability to act if we want to, but we choose not to because they haven't proven to be a problem. Now, those are terrestrial invasives, if you will, like plants. There are also, of course, a lot of invasives that are flying or in the air, like hemlock woolly adelgid or emerald ash borer. We follow the philosophy that there's nothing in our power that we can do, and there's no amount of money that we can spend at Northeast Wilderness Trust to spray chemicals and do all this management that's going to keep those things from happening. And so we're allowing, again, the core message of the presentation is freedom for nature to direct the ebb and flow of life. And as a control for the landscape, we think it's really important that there are some places where we just see what's going to happen. So this whole thing of invasives is relatively new. There are very few places where a forest has been left alone for a century to see what happens. Maybe the native species are fine. We really have no idea. And so it's important to highlight that that is the philosophy of Northeast Wilderness Trust. We are not suggesting that managing for invasives is a bad thing, and we're not suggesting that other land trusts should not do that. We're simply saying that there ought to be some places on the landscape where that's not happening, and that's a really valuable experiment for everyone to learn from, and that's what we're doing at the Wilderness Trust. Did that answer the question? Any lingering concerns? I know invasives are a super controversial issue.
Well, invasives very often are coming in because of interference from man.
Yes.
So they wouldn't, if this was property that hadn't been touched by man, those probably wouldn't be there, right?
Well, in the case of emerald ash borer, hemlock woolly adelgid, I mean, they're going everywhere regardless, whether a place is a quote-unquote pristine landscape that's never been cut or one that has been cut. And so I think the question that we have to all grapple with, and it's I would argue more of a philosophical question than what's good for the forest, is do we think that we have to manage everywhere, or is there value in leaving some places to just evolve? Species have been moving around the planet for as long as species have existed. Yes, we're moving them around a lot more now, and arguably things are exacerbated because of climate change. But 20,000 years ago, right here where we're sitting, we were under 2 miles of ice, and this whole region was scraped to bare bedrock, and the forest recovered from that. And so that's obviously taking a very long view, and we have to remove ourselves from kind of the human time scale. But a core value of what we do, again, not saying everyone should subscribe to this, but at the Wilderness Trust, we really believe in the innate resilience of nature if just left alone, to evolve and respond and naturally find balance. And we would argue that nature's been doing that for billions of years, and it could probably keep doing it if we stop mucking about everywhere. You had a question in the front.
Oh, I was gonna ask you how you go about, I guess, like picking the areas you're conserving, or like acquiring properties, like that type of.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. Oh, sorry, I'll repeat it. The question was, how does Northeast Wilderness Trust go about picking the properties that we conserve? So we are a private nonprofit. So like most nonprofits, there's limited resources to go around. We have to choose the properties that we protect wisely. We have what we call a project selection rubric that we use, for all properties that come through our doors. And that could happen a number of ways. The first thing that happens is a landowner will call us and say, it could be a million different conversations. There's a property next to us that's for sale. Can you guys protect it before it gets developed or logged or X, Y, and Z? It could be someone that's, I've been living in this place for 50 years. I need to move. I don't want to see it cut down. Will you guys buy it from me? We also respond to large timberlands that are just on the open market, and there's websites like LandVest or whatever it might be, Fountains Land, and we can just see, there's 2,000 acres for sale in Maine. Is that an important place? So the first thing is just like, what are the opportunities out there? And then we put every piece of land that we have an opportunity to look at through this rubric, and it looks at maybe like 10 or 15 different variables. So a few of them are, what's the state of the forest? And that's a spectrum. Is it old growth or is it clear cut? What are the water features on the property? What's the context of the property? Is it near existing wilderness areas? Is it an island surrounded by subdivisions? Is it near other conservation land, even if it's not wilderness? Another thing we look at is how many roads are going through the property, and are those roads publicly accessible, or are they private roads that we have the legal ability to close down and rewild? And so that's another variable. We also look at something called its resilience. And so there's this incredible tool that the Nature Conservancy has put together that has started in the Northeast, and now it's mapped all of the United States. And you could upload any parcel to this tool, and it will actually tell you, based on its underlying geology, how resilient this forest will be in the face of climate change over the next 50, 100 years, whatever the number is. And it actually pumps out a score, and so we look and say, if it's ranked above average, this is a high target. If it's ranked below average, is this something we really want to pursue? So we do all of those things. And then, unfortunately, I have to admit that the biggest factor is, do we have the ability to raise money? As a private nonprofit, we have to raise every single dollar that we utilize to buy land. Land down here is way more expensive than land in northern Maine, but we kind of say that across the Northeast, the average price per acre with the purchase price plus our cost is like $1,000 an acre. And so, do the math, and it gets very expensive. So we're regularly raising $5-6 million for big projects or $1 million for smaller projects. And we just need to look at the availability of funding. And unfortunately, sometimes there's really great properties that have really strong biodiversity value, and we can't raise the money for whatever reason. We don't have a funder there. It's not a priority for X, Y, and Z. And unfortunately, those projects aren't pursued. So that's how we select projects. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yeah.
I had a follow-up question to that. I used to work for a private nonprofit, so a lot of what you're saying very much resonates with me. And I did conservation work, but a lot of my job tended to skew toward fundraising or grant writing. And so I was curious about, because the work you do is so amazing, where your funding comes from and what your funding model is, because ultimately that, at least from my experience, is what drives what you can do. So I'm really curious to know.
I love that question. I have a fancy title of president and CEO, but I'm really just a glorified fundraiser. That's basically what I do with most of my time. We're a relative, well, I shouldn't say unique. There's basically two models of funding land conservation. You could fund land conservation through public money, whether that's federal dollars or state dollars, or you can fund conservation through private philanthropy. We fall aggressively towards the private philanthropy side. And one of the reasons for that is that there's actually very little public money available for wilderness conservation, unfortunately, and that's the reality. The largest conservation funding tools that are out there, such as like the Forest Legacy Program through the feds or even statewide programs, largely are geared towards managing forests, and many of them require trapping, which we don't allow on our properties. And so we don't apply for public money most of the time, and we have largely relied on the incredible generosity of individuals, family foundations, and private foundations, and to a certain extent, corporate foundations that care about wilderness. Did you have a question? Someone over here had a question. Oh, Sue, yeah, sorry.
Would you ever consider like reintroducing an animal to like a big portion of land somewhere down the road if it didn't come back like naturally on its own, or like it didn't have the capacity to come back because it's like so far away now?
Yeah, okay, so this is a very cool topic. And so the question is, would we ever reintroduce an animal or a species to a wilderness preserve, or maybe even broadening that out, would Northeast Wilderness Trust ever engage in reintroductions? So I talked about rewilding, and what we do is called passive rewilding, and that's really just protecting land and letting the forest regrow. When a lot of people hear the word rewilding, they think of reintroductions, and specifically, Reed Noss might have talked about this. There's this whole type of rewilding called trophic rewilding, which is all about reintroducing the apex carnivore in that ecosystem, and it has a trophic cascade that benefits everything below it. So the quick answer for your question, we have just one example of a keystone species, but not a carnivore. We have relocated beaver to one of our properties to start reestablishing beaver dams and wetlands. And so that's kind of like a direct example, but probably not what you were getting at. And so the bigger picture, as I mentioned in the presentation, New England used to have wolves and pumas, or also called mountain lions, cougars, or in Vermont, oddly, we call them catamounts. And so Northeast Wilderness Trust so there's two things here. Wolves live just north of where we all live in Canada. And there have been a number of examples in recent years of wolves using that Algonquin to Adirondack corridor coming into the Adirondacks. Unfortunately, all of those have been shot or run over But there's an opportunity. We know that wolves, if given the proper protection, both from a land perspective of like creating these core areas and stepping stones, I think it's relatively certain that wolves could come back here naturally. Cougars, on the other hand, are very unlikely to come back here naturally. Their closest population to New England is like the Black Hills and Nebraska and that area. Northeast Wilderness Trust is part of a coalition called the Cougar Research Collaborative. We are not proposing to ourselves reintroduce cougars to New England, but we're doing the research to support a possible reintroduction in the future. And one of the research projects, or I should say one of the research papers that were published out of the Cougar Research Collaborative actually looked at the natural distribution rate of cougars moving from where they currently live in the central United States to New England naturally. And it would take upwards of 90 or 100 years if that were to happen naturally, if all other things remain constant. And you can find that published research online. And so I think the conclusion for cougars is if we want to see them again in New England anytime soon, they're going to have to be reintroduced. That is, of course, a very controversial topic. And Northeast Wilderness Trust is not engaged in the actual reintroduction, but we are really interested in the science behind what it would take to do that. Do we have the proper habitat? And the answer is yes. We've identified that through research. And we also did a social tolerance study to see what did the general public of New England think about the idea of cougars, and it was relatively positive. Even among the hunting community, which was the big surprise and also the pleasant surprise, because the hunting community is essential to a reintroduction. So beyond that, there have been a number of reintroductions in the past, and there was a very unfortunately failed reintroduction of lynx in the Adirondacks maybe 20 years ago or something like that. It's something that's really important. We are missing some species in New England, and hopefully they could come back soon.
And on that note, I think we have come to the end. And
Okay.
I would like to invite anyone else who has questions to stick around. I think John will be here for a few more minutes.
Yes,
We invite additional conversation, but otherwise I'd like to thank everyone for the great questions. And John, thanks so much for coming and speaking today. We really appreciate it.